CTV's W5.
I remember waking up and really not being able to move.
An epidemic that attacked a nation's children.
The person you talked to the day before wasn't there anymore.
So these were leg braces, the bigger ones.
Won't you please join my mommy in the Mother's March on polio?
And
he was full of rage. He was not gonna stop.
a vicious attack and missed clues to a serial killer.
Oh my God, what the hell happened?
Something went wrong and answers are necessary.
I should have just stood in the corner and screamed until somebody listened.
CTV's W5 with Avery Haynes.
Welcome to W5. This time of COVID may feel unprecedented, but in many ways, we've been here before. There was a similar moment in history when the world was in search of a vaccine for a deadly virus that terrified a generation. Molly Thomas now with the valuable lessons learned during the polio scare.
I love the 50s. My kitchen's all done in 50s.
Mickey Boleyn's life in Abbotsford, British Columbia is a bit of a tribute to her favorite decade. From the classic jukebox in her kitchen,
It's the same one that's in Happy Days.
to the 1958 Ford Ranchero she still drives at the age of 81.
Sometimes we dress in the 50s to go with our cars.
It's an era she can't get enough of. What's surprising is, despite her affection for the rock and roll period, the 1950s weren't exactly kind to Mickey. In 1953, Mickey was 14 and living in Gladstone, Manitoba.
I got the most violent headache. It was like 6 people were hitting my head with hammers. And I went to the principal and said, I have to leave. I've got a terrible headache. And he said, well, I've got a headache too, and I can't go anywhere.
She's laughing now, but a violent headache was a scary symptom because back then, 67 years before COVID-19, another mysterious and terrifying virus was sweeping the country. Poliomyelitis, or polio for short.
Parents lived in fear of polio's sudden attack and the tragic aftermath.
Like COVID, polio came in waves. One difference, it mostly affected children. It was usually spread through contact with fecal matter or from an infected person. It was highly contagious and incurable. The most severe cases could permanently paralyze limbs and even the muscles that help you breathe, earning it the nickname, the crippler. But Mickey's doctor was convinced she didn't have polio because she already had a minor case when she was 8.
The doctor said, if you hadn't had polio, I'd swear that's what happened. Go home. If you're worse in the morning, get in. And by morning, I couldn't walk.
Mickey was loaded into this ambulance. Not only did it look like a hearse, but the fact that it was run by White's Funeral Home convinced Mickey of the worst.
You're in the ambulance, you're going to the hospital now. What was that experience like? What was going through your mind?
I remember laying there and thinking, so this is what it's like to be dead. It's okay, but I can't move. I couldn't move anything but my head at this time.
Mickey arrived in Winnipeg at the King George Hospital. A painful spinal tap confirmed the verdict. She had polio, again. And the hospital became her new home for the next 9 months.
They had the beds like right tight together. If I could have moved, I could have rolled in my bed all the way down to the other end.
In Canada, polio was at its peak in 1953, with nearly 9,000 cases and 500 deaths. Manitoba had the highest incidence rate in the world, with more than 2,000 people infected by the virus.
Did you think you were going to die?
I thought it was a possibility, yes, because, the person you talked to the day before wasn't there anymore.
After a few months, Mickey's paralysis subsided, but she was left permanently disabled. She spent most of a year in that hospital while her family worked the farm 2 hours away.
9 months. So you're away from your parents that whole time?
Yep. I saw them once at Christmas time. If you lived close, you could go home for Christmas. I wasn't close enough. This is a beautiful story. A wonderful nurse's aide, she couldn't have been more than 19, recently married, got permission to take me home for Christmas. They lived in the top floor of an old house, and her husband carried me upstairs, and they invited my parents and my brother, who's 5 years younger than me, for Christmas dinner. And I will never forget her, but I don't think I ever had the chance after I got out of the hospital to come back and tell her how much that meant to me. It still chokes me up.
So these were leg braces, the bigger ones.
Yeah, let's take a look at that.
So
Christopher Ruddy is a medical historian and professor at the University of Toronto.
These are designed, sort of custom built almost.
$5,000. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, that's a lot of money now.
He helped curate the polio exhibit here at Kingston, Ontario's Museum of Healthcare.
How bad was it for children in the 40s and 50s?
Well, very bad. And I mean, it could happen like that, no matter what you did.
How scary is that? I mean, even for scientists or medical professionals.
For parents, it was a nightmare. No two cases were the same. I mean, there could be very minor to be very major, because someone could not be able to breathe.
Few things are scarier than not being able to breathe. And the Winnipeg newspaper told stories that could parallel our headlines today. School closures, sports cancellations, and a climbing death toll because of a mysterious disease. Like COVID, most cases were asymptomatic, but the growing number of severe cases left patients with paralyzed diaphragms. They needed ventilators to stay alive. Again, just like COVID patients.
Back then, we didn't have ventilators like we have today. Instead, there was this giant coffin-like contraption called the iron lung. It could weigh up to 700 pounds, and it uses air pressure to help people breathe. Some polio patients lived inside of them for weeks and sometimes years. So, how does this thing work?
It's based on a negative pressure. It's basically a vacuum in there, at least close to a vacuum as possible. That's why we have portholes here, and the body of the person that's affected is, most of their body's in there, their head's out here. And this opens up in here.
For polio patients with paralyzed diaphragms, iron lungs literally did the breathing for them. Nurses used portholes to wash and change children's diapers. Sometimes pregnant women even gave birth inside of them. In 1953, as polio cases skyrocketed, the Royal Canadian Air Force was brought in to deliver them right across the country.
I thought that I was dealing with patients in a coffin.
Gloria Stevens remembers iron lungs well. She is 89, but in 1953, she was a young nursing student in Halifax. Nurses were in short supply at the Victoria General Hospital because of the epidemic. So even though she hadn't finished her training, she was thrown into the deep end in a room filled with iron lungs.
Can you imagine 14 iron lungs going like that all day long?
Iron lungs were noisy and scary, but the physical treatments were even harder on a young nurse.
We cut woolen blankets into strips, and these strips of woolen blankets were put in the water, in boiling hot water.
Gloria would wrap the hot strips around children's arms and legs. That was painful, but what happened next was sometimes worse.
Then we would exercise the limbs. In other words, we would stretch the limbs. Their muscles would be in such terrific spasm that they'd be in terrific pain. And so there was a lot of crying too.
How do you deal with, seeing all of that pain and dealing with so much death of kids that are so young?
Well, I can hardly say this now without crying. Just a minute. The very first child that I saw pass away was a polio patient. And I was sort of her main nurse. And so I was working very hard to do everything I could to save her. And then we finally realized that she wasn't going to make it. And so I actually stayed overtime to be with her when she passed, and I still remember her. So I'm getting kind of weepy after all these years.
Gloria worked in that polio ward 12 hours a day, 6.5 days a week for 7 months.
I've written some personal stories. I've done a lot of interviews to different people.
Oh. Gloria is showing her neighbor, who's also a registered nurse, her recollections of that era. In fact, she wrote it all down in a book so she'll never forget.
So she was considered to be one of the first victims in Halifax.
Did you as a nurse, become like a mother to these kids?
Yes, we did, especially the small ones. We'd carry them around if we could a bit, but you couldn't handle them too much because they were in so much pain. But if we could, we would hug them and try to be with them.
Mickey Boleen felt that love from nurses in her Winnipeg hospital. So much that it inspired her to become a nurse herself, serving others for 35 years, despite her disability.
If you could say one thing to the nurses that were around you for that 9 months of your life, what would you want to say to them?
The only thing I ever wanted to be was a nurse, and you made me even more determined. And I hope it made me half as caring and as all of you were. You were great.
Coming up,
I was very aware that something was really wrong.
children's quarantine fractures families.
They could only see me once a week through a glass window.
When W5 continues.
In the 1950s, Canada was one of the hardest hit nations on Earth when it came to polio. Children lost the use of their limbs and often struggled to breathe. Hundreds of others died. Much like COVID-19 today, medical scientists were on a crusade to find a vaccine for the mystery disease. Canada's health minister at the time was Paul Martin Sr., the father of former Prime Minister Paul Martin Jr., and a man who knew about polio all too well.
My father had polio when he was 8 years old. He was blind in his left eye for his whole life, and his left arm and shoulder were relatively useless to him.
But polio struck the Martin family again, this time Paul Jr.
So take me back to when you were 8. Did you even know what polio was?
I'm not sure you realize what you've just asked me. Take me back to when I was 8. That was a long, long time ago.
Paul Martin is now 82 and retired from a long career in business and politics. But he still remembers being a young boy with a stomachache that threw his mother into a panic.
So were you rushed to the hospital that moment that you started to feel odd?
My mother didn't give me 10 minutes that I came home. I said, look, I've got this funny feeling. It was very, very similar to what people feel today with COVID-19. That constant awareness that there was just something that was going to possibly hit you.
Since his polio symptoms were minor, Martin wasn't too worried until one fateful day.
Tell me about the first time that you saw an iron lung. What is going through your mind?
They brought in a strange machine, and I asked the fella in the bed next to me, who was about 13, 14, he was an adult almost by our standard. I said, what's that? He said, that's an iron lung, and that's where you're going to end up. And that's when it hit me that I was really in trouble.
That would freak you out.
The iron lung story had an effect on me. There's no doubt about it. It has an effect on me now. I shiver now when I tell you the story.
Martin never spent time in an iron lung, and he made a full recovery. But his father, the health minister, knew firsthand what polio was capable of. And that knowledge may have prevented thousands of children from being struck by the dreaded virus. At the time, researchers had been searching for vaccines with checkered success. Soon the public got involved. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had polio himself, founded the March of Dimes.
March of Dimes funds were needed everywhere, needed desperately by patients, needed by an army of scientists who searched for a preventive.
The foundation raised millions to pay for polio treatment, and ultimately the medical breakthrough by Dr. Jonas Salk.
The vaccine could be considered 80 to 90% effective against paralytic poliomyelitis.
Salk had created a vaccine, and in 1955, it was being produced in both the US and here at the Connet Laboratories in Toronto. Health Minister Martin was a big supporter.
The Connaught Laboratories, at present, the sole source in Canada of the vaccine, is engaged in doing everything that it can to provide the maximum amount for the use of our children.
But then, a curveball.
There was a bad batch in the United States, a company called Cutter Labs. And the Americans immediately stopped the vaccine totally on the possibility that it wasn't a bad batch, but on the possibility that the vaccine was actually causing polio.
His father, the health minister, was at a crossroads. Follow the US and stop producing, or plow ahead. Even the prime minister, Louis Saint Laurent, wanted him to stop.
You gotta understand, my father was a polio victim, his son was a polio victim, and the only thing that he could think of was, if I stop this vaccine, there are all kinds of kids out there who are going to get polio.
Paul Martin Sr. stood behind the research at Connaught Labs at great political risk.
My dad said, I have confidence in Connaught, and I have confidence in their production of this vaccine. I'm not going to stop. The Americans stopped. Canadians didn't. And the fact is that it turned out it was a bad batch. It was not the vaccine. But there are a lot of Canadian kids who got the vaccine when they might not have gotten it.
The new vaccines stimulate production by the body of billions of protective antibodies, which build a wall between children and dread polio.
I guess you're pretty proud of your dad, hey?
I'm very proud of my dad.
How key was Canada to bringing that vaccine to the world?
Essential, critical. Wouldn't have happened without it, basically.
Medical historian Christopher Ruddy says Martin saved the vaccine. A massive inoculation campaign began, and by mid-1956, 1.8 million Canadian children were vaccinated, just in time to avoid the next polio wave. But that was too late for David Onley.
Well, this must take you back.
Oh, gosh.
David Onley is a former lieutenant governor of Ontario.
So I essentially made the front page of the paper when I was 3 years old, but for all the wrong reasons. Dreaded poliomyelitis struck for the 4th time in Midland this week. David Onley, 3-year-old son of Alderman and Mrs. Charles Onley, was rushed by ambulance to Sick Children's Hospital, Toronto, Wednesday morning, where his condition is reported as serious, which it was.
The paralysis hit him from the neck down, affecting his arms and legs.
I'm laughing there, but those were always painful visits because you knew that they're just going to be very brief and then they'd be gone for another week.
As a little boy, I mean, 7 months away from your parents, what does that do to you?
It creates major separation anxiety, major. You don't see your mom and dad because they can only see me once a week through a glass window and, for 10 or 15 minutes. And that was worse than not seeing them at all because after a while, you just sort of forget about them.
When David was finally released from hospital, he started physiotherapy. But what happened next was nothing less than horrifying.
Dr. McRae began the exercise process on my grandparents' kitchen table. And the thing was, it was enormously painful. And so he would tell my parents and grandparents they had to leave.
Because you were writhing in pain? I mean, were you screaming?
No, because they didn't want them to see him when he pulled out his knife and put it to my throat and say, you move this leg or I'm going to slit your throat right now and let you bleed to death. Now move the leg. Well, you know what? I moved the leg and I moved the arm and I moved whatever he wanted me to because I believed him.
The unorthodox, and some would say barbaric approach would get a doctor's license revoked today. But David Onley says it worked.
I was able to walk with a cane, that I was able to run a limited amount. I mean, I was recovering in a major way.
Over years, multiple surgeries and treatments improved David's mobility. He eventually started wearing leg braces, which were a game changer.
What was it like, I mean, at 12 years of age, all of a sudden having to wear a brace?
Well, actually, it liberated me because I was no longer falling.
Okay.
And it then allowed me to basically play ball hockey as the goalie.
David wrote a letter to his hockey hero. Toronto Maple Leafs goalie Johnny Bower. He explained how his braces hindered him from flopping around like a pro goaltender. And guess what? Bower wrote back.
Dear David, I think you're a brave little boy. Develop your catching hand by bouncing a ball or playing catch with a tennis ball. For the rest, I'd say a stand-up goalie is a big factor.
Decades later, when Onley became lieutenant governor, he was handing out philanthropy awards, and Johnny Bower was on that list.
So it was such a cool moment. It was one of the most, started getting emotional, but there I am giving my, my hero an award. You don't know what a simple act can do and mean for somebody, and it did for me.
Retired nurse Gloria Stevens says she sees one more parallel between polio and COVID-19, how people regard the needle that promises protection. Gloria administered hundreds of vaccines to school kids in the 1950s.
Obviously, Gloria, there's a growing anti-vaccine movement that's come out around COVID. I mean, are you worried about that?
I'm very worried about that. I don't understand why people are saying, I don't need to be told what to do. I've got my own mind and I can make it up. But that's true too. But science is there. You can't legislate against stupidity. Whoops.
And even though Mickey Boline is one of the few people on the planet who's had polio twice, she's still taken the vaccine 3 times. After cherished years of celebrating the 50s, she knows it's a life worth protecting.
It's been a good life, and I'm not finished.
The World Health Organization says that governments need to commit to restarting immunization programs to prevent polio from regaining a foothold.